I'd like to start off this presentation with a question, and that is, what do you think of when you hear the words open source? Well, if you're at a conference like this one, I'm pretty sure there are words that are positive, things like altruism, free software, and community. We have all these warm, fuzzy feelings around the idea of open source, but the implementation of these ideas can be very different. And that brings us to this question: what makes a project open source? I think for some people, they believe that a project becomes open source when it is uploaded here to GitHub. It's public now, so it must be open source, right? In my experience, projects that stop here after being uploaded to GitHub, those projects tend to die. Sure, someone somewhere might use it, and I certainly do not want to discourage anyone from sharing code on GitHub or GitLab or wherever you prefer to share it, but it is one thing to upload a project to GitHub and call it open source. It is quite another to commit to governing a community of users and contributors, to shepherding that project through its lifespan. It almost goes without saying that open source governance can be hard. That's probably why you're sitting here listening to a talk on it. The reason it can be hard is because in open source governance, technical skills and communication skills are intertwined. You cannot have a successful open source project, a project with lasting value, with only one or the other. The hardest parts of open source are not the technical parts, nor are they necessarily the communication parts. The hardest parts of open source are the places that technology and humanity intersect. And even though these might be the hardest parts, they are also the most vital. They are what separate a successful project, a project which evolves and grows and continues to expand its value, from an unsuccessful project which is shared to GitHub and then dies. Governing an open source project can sometimes seem like an impossible job. Even though I can't tell you it will ever be easy, I can tell you successful open source governance is possible. The reason I'm here today is because I have seen this success myself, and I want to help you be successful in governing your own open source projects. And with that, let's pause. A little bit about me. I'm Nell Shamrell-Harrington. I'm a principal software engineer at Microsoft. I'm also a board member of the new Rust Foundation, longtime open source contributor to the Chef projects, to the Rust projects, to Microsoft projects, and many more. And feel free to tweet at me at Nell Shamrell if you want to get in touch. In my experience in open source, as a user, contributor, and maintainer of multiple projects, I found that the hardest parts can be condensed into three main categories. I call these the three duties of open source governance. And the first is to make it easy to contribute. That might sound simple, but it's not simple when you realize how many different types of development environments are out there. The second duty is to assist users of the project. As the maintainer, you are on the front lines of answering requests for help. And the third duty is to manage contributions to the project. Now, these might sound pretty obvious, and the ideas of them certainly are, but when you get into the nitty-gritty of implementing these ideas in the real world, it's anything but obvious. And that's what this talk is about: the things that come up in the real world when you're involved in open source governance and how to make it work. With that, let's start with the first duty of governance: making it easy to contribute. When we're experiencing those warm, fuzzy feelings around contributing to open source, we tend to think it involves two things. The first is finding a project on GitHub, then forking it, then making changes within that fork, and then submitting those changes in a pull request. This seems amazingly simple from the outside, but there is a lot that happens in between these two steps of forking a project and submitting a pull request. A lot of things that we don't always think about. In particular, one of the hardest parts of contributing to open source is just getting any development environment set up at all, let alone one that is consistent with other contributors. Furthermore, once you have set up the development environment and made changes, you then have to test those changes. And if setting up development environments on inconsistent workstations is hard, running tests on inconsistent workstations is even worse. Some projects try to get around this by only supporting certain types of workstations. And while this might help mask the problem of different development environments, it also significantly narrows down the list of potential contributors and hinders this first duty of making it easy to contribute. One solution, which I have seen very effective, is creating virtual workstations that a contributor can spin up on their local machine. This is a project called Clearly Defined. It's one of the main projects I work on at Microsoft. It scrapes various package repositories and open source repositories and gathers together licensing information for open source software. And how this project is set up is it's set up as a series of microservices. We have our front end UI, which is written in React. We have our back end API, which is written in Node. And then we have a crawler. The crawler is also written in Node, and that's what crawls package repositories like NPM, like Ruby gems, like crates.io, and gathers that license information so that we can make a determination of what the license is most likely to be and serve that up to the user. When I started at Microsoft, it took me a little over 2 weeks to get my development environment set up. So I knew there had to be a better way. And I knew if I was having trouble, an external contributor was going to have even more trouble. So what I did was created a Dockerized development environment. Anyone who can run Docker can use the same development environment as all the other maintainers through using Docker Compose. They can choose to spin up only one of the microservices, or they can choose to spin up any number or all of them to test how the different services interact and how they work together. This works no matter what operating system someone is using. It can be Mac, it can be Linux, it can be PC. It probably can even be something like FreeBSD, though I'm not 100% sure on that. Anything that can run Docker can run this development environment. The key thing to making this successful is to commit to supporting the development environment along with the rest of the project. If the development environment breaks, that means the project is broken, and the first priority of the maintainers needs to be to fix it. In order to fulfill this first duty, the maintainers need to keep the development environment functional at all times. Once someone has their development environment set up and has made changes to the code, they then have to test those changes. And if dealing with different development environments is a challenge, trying to run tests in different environments is nearly impossible. One way to help with this is to use a continuous integration service, something like Travis CI or Circle CI or GitHub Actions. These allow contributors to run automated tests in a consistent environment and avoids those problems where a test passes on one person's machine but fails on another person's machine. This is crates.io, the community software sharing site for the Rust language. In this project, we have GitHub Actions set up so that every time someone opens a pull request, it automatically kicks off a test run in several different environments. Once that test run is complete, the results display in the pull request itself. It returns consistent results, and open source consistency, it can be uncommon, but it's a beautiful thing when it happens. Even if someone has an environment where running the tests locally is difficult, they still have the option to run them through opening a pull request and seeing the results. It also makes things much easier for the maintainers when they are reviewing the pull request. They can instantly see whether those automated tests pass. There's certainly more to making contributing to a project easy, but these two parts, setting up the development environment and testing changes, these are the ones that have given me the most grief historically. Luckily, as we just saw, there are solutions that make them easier. Maintaining those consistent development and testing environments, it won't necessarily ever be easy, but these solutions make it possible. That's the first duty of open source governance, making it easy on the contributor's side, even if it is not always easy on the maintainer's side. Let's move on to the second duty, assisting users with the project. As an open source maintainer, you are on the front lines of answering requests for help. Most requests for help to an open source project come through a GitHub issue. These may be bug reports, they may be feature requests, or sometimes they're a combination of both. When the issue is a bug report, the hard part is often replicating the issue, especially when your project has many dependencies and is used in many different types of environments. Sometimes the issue actually isn't in your project at all, but it's in an upstream dependency of your project. This is also a hard part, and we'll cover how to deal with that in just a moment. But first, let's concentrate on replicating an issue. It is especially hard to do this when the person who filed the issue is using the project in a different environment than you as the maintainer. They may be seeing a bug that only shows up in very specific conditions. Well, it's never going to be easy, but there are things you can do to make replicating an issue faster and more effective. Let's look at a real example. This is the repository for VS Code. It's an editor a lot of you are probably familiar with. People use VS Code on many different workstations to create many different types of applications. This means the number of potentially different conditions where someone might see a bug is quite high. When a user sees a bug, we need to know exactly how they are running VS Code in order to diagnose it. To help with this, VS Code uses a built-in template that auto-populates whenever someone opens up a GitHub issue. This lays out exactly what the maintainers need to know about a user's environment and tells them upfront what information they need to provide. It's very hard to miss that you need to provide certain information or certain environmental details when the template appears anytime you file an issue. Templates are one of the most helpful things you can implement in your project. Remember, what might be obvious to the maintainer of an open source project is not always obvious to a user. It saves a lot of time and a lot of back and forth by stating exactly what you need up front where the user cannot miss it. After reproducing a bug, it's not uncommon for it to be due to an upstream dependency of the project rather than the project itself. In cases like these, it can be tempting to close an issue as not my problem. But if the problem manifests in your project, even if it's due to an external dependency, it is your problem. As a maintainer, it is your responsibility to 1, communicate the issue to the maintainers of the upstream project, and 2, communicate it to the person or persons who filed the issue in your project, and 3, update the issue in your project regularly with the progress of the upstream issue being fixed. It is your responsibility to keep your users informed and to let them know when the issue is fixed. If the upstream maintainer is ultimately not able to fix the issue, and I recommend giving them at least a day to respond and sometimes a little more than that to get the fix in. But if you still cannot get a response from them, you will need to consider changing the dependency. Sometimes a maintainer will go dark. It definitely happens. And as an open source maintainer, you need to be prepared to change dependencies when needed. There are certainly more parts to assisting with open source project, but these two, replicating issues and dealing with upstream issues, are among the most frequent that come up. Dealing with them can be hard, but it is certainly possible. And that covers the second duty of open source governance. So let's talk about the third duty, managing contributions to the project. There are 2 main parts to managing contributions when you are an open source maintainer. The first is determining whether a contribution adds value to the project. We'll go a little more in depth on exactly how to do that shortly. And the other is when a contribution ultimately does not add value, saying no in a way which still supports the contributor and treats both them and their work with empathy and respect. First, let's go over a few things that definitely add value to a project. And the first one I want to highlight is documentation. This is by far the most useful contribution to receive, especially as there is no better documentation than what comes from someone who is actively using the project. When I maintain an open source project, I become so used to looking at it and understanding it that it is easy for me to lose sight of what someone using the project without my perspective experiences. Any contributions which make that experience easier are very valuable. And the next is typo fixes. Occasionally, typos do sneak into projects. Hopefully not in the actual code that executes, though I have seen that, but also in other aspects like documentation and instructions. At best, typos make the project look unprofessional, and at worst, they can be outright misleading. As a maintainer, I have often been staring at the code and documentation for so long that my eyes just glaze over small typos. Too many typos makes a project hard to understand, and corrections to those typos are very valuable. Small bug fixes are another major thing that add value to a project. One of my absolute favorite types of pull requests to receive is when someone has found a minor bug and reported it by fixing it and submitting a pull request. Whenever a pull request fits into one of these categories, things which definitely add value, I often merge them that same day, sometimes within the same hour, because the value they add is immediate. Now let's talk about the flip side. There are a few things that definitely do not add value to a project. And this includes white space changes. This comes up more often than you would think. Unless a project has a style guide and you are correcting a violation to it, white space changes do not add value to a project. My guiding rule is that if the pull request changing white space does not violate, my guiding rule is that if it does not violate an established style guide, leave it alone. White space changes just for the sake of white space changes cause merge conflicts, and the value add is negligible. If I, as a maintainer, receive a pull request that only changes white space and it's not related to established style convention, I will not merge it. The other thing that does not add value to a project is big features. I'm talking more than 100 lines of non-test code when the contributor has not talked to the maintainer first. This is because it may not fit in with the plan for the project, or it may be something that is already in the works but not yet public. It is truly heartbreaking to have someone spend a ton of time on a new feature only to have to close their pull request without merging it. Large features, when a contributor has not talked to the maintainer first, do not add value. So now we've covered a few things that definitely add value and a few things that definitely do not add value to a project. And it certainly would be really nice if all pull requests were this clear, but more often than not, pull requests are for things that sometimes add value to a project. The first is small features, something that is not a bug fix, but adds new behavior. I consider a feature small when it is less than 100 lines of non-test code. And sometimes even large features add value, but only if the person opening the pull request has talked to the maintainer beforehand. Again, it is heartbreaking when someone has clearly spent a ton of time and effort on a pull request, but as a maintainer, I have to reject it because it just is not right for the project at that time. So if these sometimes add value and sometimes do not add value, how do you determine which is the case at any given time? When a pull request comes in and you're not sure of the value, it helps to ask a few key questions. One, does it fix an existing issue? When a pull request fixes an existing issue or fulfills an existing feature request, there is often value in that, especially if multiple people have requested the same thing. The second thing to consider is if the pull request replicates work that has already been done elsewhere. Occasionally, multiple people will submit pull requests that fix the same issue, and you as the maintainer then have to compare them to determine which might solve the issue in the best way for the project at that particular time. And the final key question is whether a pull request affects in-progress work. If it is something that will potentially cause nasty merge conflicts with development that is already in flight, the value of that pull request might be negative, at least until the in-flight work is complete. The biggest thing to remember is that a contribution returns negative value when it makes other contributions harder. Even if it is something that might actually be the superior option purely from a technical standpoint, if it makes contributions from others harder, it does not add value to the project. When something ultimately does not end up adding value, it is crucial to 1, communicate it, and 2, communicate it in a supportive way. Open source projects live and die by community engagement. If someone's first experience with your project is awful, chances are they are not going to come back, and they might warn others to stay away from your project. Always, always, always say thank you. Even if the pull request is something I as a maintainer cannot ultimately use, I need to recognize that someone went through the time and effort to put together that pull request and submit it. that the person who opened the pull request is most likely a well-meaning human being who has taken an interest in my project. In addition to saying thank you, if you do not end up merging a pull request, always, always, always say why. There is little more frustrating for a contributor to spend a lot of time on a pull request, even if it's something they really should have talked to the maintainer about first, and then have it just be closed without any explanation of why. Sometimes it's because of a technical reason. Sometimes it's because it conflicts with in-flight work, and sometimes it just isn't the right thing for the project at that time. Regardless of the reason, always at least give your contributors the benefit of knowing why their work was not merged. It's frankly just cruel to leave them in limbo. These parts of managing contributions, determining the value, and communicating the decision on the value, these are some of the hardest parts of open source because they, more than perhaps anything else, touch on that intersection of technology and humanity, both the humans using the technology and the humans creating the technology. Even though these parts are the hardest, again, they are the most vital. They're what separate a successful project, a project which lives and evolves and grows, that people stay engaged in, from an unsuccessful project where engagement tapers off and the project dies. Open source governance can sometimes seem like an impossible job. But what I hope you take away from this talk is that even though it may not be easy, it is possible to be successful with it. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and unshare my screen. And I believe we have time for some questions. So I'm not seeing any in the Q&A now. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in there. I know asking the first question is always a little bit difficult, especially when you're a little bit shy like I am. So don't be shy. Feel free to ask anything you've always wanted to know about open source, or anything you want to know about open source governance. Oh, there's a question. Is it embarrassing for a project to only have one contributor? It depends on the project. If it's a project that, let's say it's an npm package, a very small npm package that only does a specific thing for a specific use case, that might be okay for it to only have one contributor. But if it has one contributor, you still want to make it able to be contributed to by more people. So you still want things like a contribution file. You still want that CI CD set up. So is it embarrassing? I don't think so. Where it would, not usually, but where it would be embarrassing if it's a major corporation that has said, we are going open source, and then the only contributors after the project has been open source for a year or two are employees of that company. That does happen a lot. And that might be an open code project, but if there's not a community around it, I don't personally identify that as an open source project. So it depends, is like so many questions. That's the answer. It depends. Cool. Another question. Other than GitHub, where are other good places to share projects? GitLab is one. There's a number of open source projects there. There's some for if you don't use Git, if you use something like SVN or other places, those also have places to share projects. So GitHub, GitLab, a source repository, any kind of source repository is a good place to share projects. I would say for sharing the code, at least, I would say for sharing the executable, build the project, something like npm if it's a node project, crates.io if it's Rust crate, one of the major community sharing sites. Waiting on some other questions. Anonymous attendee asks, how to make money by open source. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend the meeting with that title. Well, I would definitely look at the recording for that one. But if you're talking, I mean, the best way I've found to make money doing open source is to join a company that is already producing some of its products in an open source fashion. Before I worked at Microsoft, I worked at Mozilla. A lot of their products are open source. They are a profitable company. Before that, I worked at Chef. A lot of their products are open sourced. What Chef did is they made a change where the code for all their major products was open source, but the binary builds they created from that code, those required a license that required people to pay for them. It was kind of a controversial change. It was very interesting, but that is one way they do it. If you're an independent developer, GitHub sponsors can be a possibility. You can have a project uploaded to GitHub sponsors and ask people to help support you doing it by sponsoring you through that. I've seen people use Patreon, and there's a few others. So it depends on whether you want to work for a major corporation or whether you want to be an independent developer. Any other questions? I guess I can. Oh, go ahead. James Mitchell asks, what are the criteria to you to determine whether an open source project is healthy or not? That's a good question. What I often look at is if I looking at a project in GitHub, I'll look at the issues that are open. It's not necessarily a bad thing if there's a high number of issues open. With a big project like Rails or the Rust project, it's common for there to be a lot of issues open, but I sort them by last responded to or most recently responded to and see when the last activity happened on one of those issues. It's the same thing with pull requests. If there are a bunch of open pull requests, again, doesn't necessarily mean the project isn't healthy, but I sort by last responded to and see if the maintainer has been responding to those pull requests. They might have a variety of reasons they aren't able to merge it in right away. Those are certainly valid, but I see whether the maintainer is communicating on issues or maintainers are communicating on issues and pull requests in a fairly timely fashion. If you're looking for a project to contribute to, I look for projects that when you look at the issues, there's labels like good first issue or help available. That shows the maintainers of the project are committed to helping onboard new contributors and are probably going to provide a more supportive environment for new contributors. I mean, opening your first pull request is scary. It was certainly scary for me, but there are ways to tell whether a project is likely to be a supportive environment or whether it might be a toxic environment. And a lot of that is through observing the interactions the maintainers have with users of the project or others contributors to the project. Just going to grab a quick drink of water. I see someone just put in chat. I appreciate the shout out to typo fixers and folks who write documentation. Absolutely. If you release a project and people can't tell how to use it, that project's going to die. There needs to be documentation that shows people how to use it. And, 10, 15 years ago in the open source community, I was just getting started in open source at that point. People would say, well, users should just be able to look at the code and understand it and figure out how to use the project. That's not the case anymore. The thing with open source is, the goals of 10, 20 years ago to have every company on the planet, every government on the planet using open source software, well, we won that battle. That has come to pass. But part of that means even more people are using open source than ever, and they need to know how to. And it's not only coders who are using open source. All right. Anonymous attendee says, is there any reason why not to join open source foundations? Well, it depends on the foundation. I the reason we put together the Rust Foundation was so that there would be an independent entity where various companies could donate to support the project, and that would steward the project. So that is a good reason to join an open source foundation. A reason not to join an open source foundation, see what there. It depends. I mean, something like the Linux Foundation, something like the Software Freedom Conservancy, I would talk to other people who are in the foundation and or who are members of the foundation and ask them what it's like. If it's an environment where questions are not being answered in a timely fashion, that might show that the foundation is overcommitted and under-resourced. So that might not be one you as a maintainer want to join necessarily. But if you're going to donate, those are great ones to donate to. So it depends on the foundation. Is there any reason why not to join open source foundations? Then another question, is there such thing as over-documented? I've written more documentation than code before. I have never seen an over-documented project. And it's important to remember that lots of people who use projects have very different skill levels. So I've seen some people say, well, I don't want to document this because this should be obvious to everyone. It's not. It's not. Even people who are experienced. So no, I have never seen an over-documented project yet. Other questions? James Mitchell says, the future you may even thank you for documentation. Yes. It's fun. I've been doing technical talks for a very long time now. And I have sometimes gone back to my talks a few years later to remember how I explained how to do something so that I could remember how I was doing something. So I was explaining to my future self in that talk, even though I didn't realize it at the time. So yes, always document. Cool. Gerardo asks, what are some strategies to work with unofficial forks and documentation? That's a good question. I have seen, projects be forked by an organization because that organization wants to take it in a different direction than the parent organization of the project that they forked. That is certainly an option. It is absolutely always an option to fork a project in open source. Strategies to work with unofficial forks. It's similar to working with the official forks. If you find something in the unofficial fork that is also a problem in the official fork, I would document in the unofficial fork and also submit that documentation to I guess not the official fork, but to the original repository. It's hard because there's users who are using both of them and they might be running into the same problems. I would submit it to both. I consider that just being a good open source citizen. Now, if there are differences with the unofficial fork, I would only submit that documentation to the unofficial fork. People who use that fork are probably using it for slightly different reasons than they would use the parent repository. All right. Next question. Anonymous Tenny says, should early stage projects be concerned about forking in order to attract rival community or attention? Or be closed source initially, perhaps? Grateful for any thoughts. Great question. When I'm working on a new project, I do keep it closed for at least a few weeks, sometimes a few months, when I'm figuring out what the project is and getting together the first iteration. The reason I do that is when I release it as open source, I want it to be something that where there is already a cohesive design to it before I open it up for comments, contributions, etc. from the world. And that is because it can be easy when you have a lot of people with a lot of opinions on the project to kind of lose that cohesiveness to it, to lose that purpose that it was going to do first. So I often have it closed source, at least initially, until I get that cohesive vision established and at least somewhat implemented. As for concern about forking in order to attract rival community or attention, I have seen people use forks maliciously, where they said, well, this project isn't doing what we're wanting it to do, so we are going to fork it and we are going to steal all of the community and bring it over to our fork, and then we're going to be the default iteration for what people use. I have rarely seen that work, in part because it is obvious to the community that it's something that's being done as a way, as kind of, it's forking for a revenge purpose. And that doesn't mean that the project is going to be maintained if someone forks it. And often those forks eventually die. So I would say, if you have a community member who's threatening to fork, ask them why. See if you can address their concerns. If you can't, they are certainly welcome to fork the project, but that doesn't mean that it's going to kill your project if someone forks it. If your project already has some momentum around it, already has some community around it, it's difficult for a fork to, in my experience, to steal, if you will, a significant portion of that community, especially if it's a healthy community where empathy is practiced. Some people, I know there's a stereotype of open source communities as being really toxic. They aren't all like that. They really, really aren't. Rust community is very healthy. Chef community, when I was there, was very healthy. There are good communities out there. So as for being concerned about a fork, if someone says they're going to fork, I would always ask why, see if there's a way you can address their concerns. If not, they might go ahead and fork, and you should kind of monitor that fork, but that doesn't mean that your project is going to die. Other questions? Any follow-ups to the questions I've answered? All right. Well, I think we're coming toward the end of time. Any other final questions before we wrap up? I guess one last thing I'd like to say is I have found when I'm working for a company and we're trying to recruit other people, if I make a very welcoming contributor setup, a very healthily governed project, when people contribute and contribute significant work, that is one of the best ways to find potential employees. Because I've worked with them on the open source project, I already have an idea of how they work, how they communicate. That is one of the best ways to do it. So, I mean, open source is not free labor, no matter what people say, because there is labor involved, or there is work involved in evaluating pull requests and figuring out whether to merge them. But it's one of the best ways to find people interested in your project who might be interested in working on it full time if you are a company that is doing open source. Oh, well, you're very welcome, Martin. Glad to share my experience and a little bit of my battle scars to help others.